like to welcome Cody Keenan. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Written some of President Obama's best speeches, had a career of sort of putting words in other people's mouths. What are some of the words that have had the most impact on you?
I'll begin by saying you're giving me too much credit, but you know the best thing about working for Barack Obama is that he was really our chief speechwriter, and that makes a big difference. He knew what he wanted to say. He knew the stories he wanted to tell. We were just kind of vessels for him. You know, if he had 48 hours in a day, he'd probably write all of his own speeches. But the words that moved me were often the ones that he inspired us to tell. You know, what's any great speech speaks to something bigger than the moment. You know, who are we? Where have we been? Where are we going? What's the kind of long sweep of America and the human trajectory? Specifically, you know, the speeches I'd pick are pretty cliche, but they're great for a reason. You know, Dr. King's "I Have a Dream," John F. Kennedy's first inaugural and his moonshot, Lincoln's second inaugural. But you can really find inspiration anywhere. I mean, one of the best pieces of advice President Obama ever gave me was read widely. And you know, that's the best way to come up with new ideas, to find new fonts of empathy to fuel your writing.
So what was the process? What you're describing is really a co-creation process with him for the speeches. Talk us through that. I mean, you've some speeches, obviously, we need one in 20 minutes. Some of them, we have 3 months. What was the process maybe for the longer ones, or the sort of major ones where we've got to make a big impact?
Yeah, you're exactly right. He always referred to us as collaborators. And the process for any major speech was we would sit down first for about a half hour and say, okay, blue sky. You know, we have no pretend politics don't exist, pretend Congress doesn't exist. Don't look at today's news. What's the story we want to tell? What do we want to talk about here? If there was, you know, nothing standing in our way. And then we'd usually come back a day or two after that and come down from 40,000 feet to 20,000 feet and you know, to start talking through the speech. And you know, we would furiously write while he was just brainstorming on the fly. And we call it the download. And you know, he's a pretty logical, linear mind, which was helpful. I mean, he would basically have the outline for a speech in his head. And that saved us a lot of time from having to come up with what it is. And we would go, you know, put the meat on the bones of it. We'd do research, we'd talk to our policy wonks, we'd read widely. You know, we'd put our actual researcher on task of finding stories, find us some letters that people have written to the president, find some historical moments that sync in with this. And once you've kind of put that whole brew together, we'd serve it up to him in a draft. And yeah, the good news was if he'd make edits on it, that means it's already something he can work with. The bad news is if he'd call you and say, see me, or just write see me on it. And that's not because he wants to tell you how great you are and send you on your way. It's because he has different thoughts. But he would often whip out the yellow pad on his own, too, and do a lot of writing by hand. And we'd incorporate that into any draft.
When you're putting the flesh on the bones, part of that, I guess, is finding a way to have empathy with the audience, relate to what they're relating to.
Of course.
How do you do that? What is a way you can do that, particularly if it's somebody from, or an audience from a very different background to yourself and outside of the Washington bubble that you necessarily live in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, empathy is critical to speech writing. It's vital. It's because you've got to, for whoever you're speaking to, you've got to be able to put yourself in their shoes. You know, as Atticus Finch said in *To Kill a Mockingbird*, but you got to put on their skin and walk around for a little while. And one way we do that actually was the president's idea when he first took office, which is give me 10 letters every day from ordinary Americans. And he'd get, I think, maybe 10,000 a day. And we had this great correspondence shop that would pick out a random sample of 10 that kind of ran the gamut from love mail, hate mail, a letter from a kid, letters about specific policy. And we'd read those too, those 10 letters. And you know, often
so he would read them and you would read them?
I'd read them too.
Yeah.
And sometimes he'd actually call me up to the Oval Office and say, this is a great letter, you know, let's tell this person's story. Of course, we'd seek their permission before we ever did. And there were a couple times we actually went to visit somebody who wrote a letter and build a speech around that person. There was a woman named Rebecca Erler who wrote in from Minnesota back in 2014, and it was this gorgeous letter about the struggles of a young middle-class mother. And the president ended up meeting her 3 or 4 times. She was in the State of the Union address in 2015, sat next to Michelle Obama, and he always said, you know, she reminds me of my own mom when my mom was young and the type of stuff that we went through. And after we told her story in the State of the Union address, we started getting all these letters to the president saying, I know that woman, I am that woman, this is my life. And that's a much better way to connect with people than to just say, I feel your pain. Because anyone, even Barack Obama, who was an unknown 4 years before taking office, who was pumping his gas and paying student loans, Once you're flying around an Air Force One and living in the most expensive prison in the world, it's hard to connect to people. And so we would often deploy letters just for that reason.
With doing a speech, when you're building it together, what is the structure you use? Is there any set structure, any different kinds of structures?
No, we typically just set out to tell a story, you know, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. There was no template we ever used. We'd call the top the handshake with the crowd, and often, you know, if we go to a high school, we know the sport mascot is. We talk about some of the things that are going on there. Make sure you don't get it wrong. That's where research comes in. And then we just kind of tell a story and tell it straight. And, you know, we rarely intentionally deployed lofty rhetoric because people can tell when you're trying too hard. Not every moment calls for Lincoln or JFK. Right. Yeah, exactly. And when we got to do it, it was a blast. But most speeches, you know, we did 3,577 in the White House. And only a couple dozen will be remembered. I mean, that's just the way it works. It doesn't mean the rest were bad. It means a lot of them were mundane. You know, you're pushing a message or whatnot. How
do you get your mind into doing a speech that you know possibly will not be delivered? I'm thinking about, you know, the Man on the Moon speech.
Yeah.
Where they did not, fortunately, die on the moon, but they had to write a speech just in case.
Yeah, we had some of those as well. Every time the Supreme Court was going to rule on something, we'd always have a couple options in the can, like just in case they ruled against marriage equality.
Terrible.
Or,
great.
Yeah, struck down Obamacare. But we prepared for those just as carefully because we knew that in the moment you don't want to tell the president you're not ready. Right. Fortunately, we never prepared any concession speeches, and we got away with that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.